thank you for organizing this session on questions which I believe are very relevant for the study of new religious movements such as gatekeeping and false news. What I will do is to discuss in general gatekeeping in the first part, and in the second part to propose a case study of a cultic murder which took place in China in 2014. Next one. So the first is a theoretical model of how gatekeeping works. There are some gatekeepers, media or governments. They filter the news. Sometimes they produce false news. They create a stereotype of the cults, and the effect is a certain image of cults in the public opinion. So first, what's gatekeeping? Next one. To the risk of preaching to the converted in this room, I have to remember that gatekeeping in sociology is a concept which was not introduced about the news. Kurt Lewin, in the first study of gatekeeping, discusses food. He noticed in an average American supermarket in the 40s, there were several thousand food items. But on the table of an average American family, there were less than 50. So he concluded there is a gates filtering what kind of food actually lands on the table, and the housewife was the gatekeeper. Next one. In 1950, a professor of journalism, David White, actually applied in a systematic way the gatekeeping theory to news. He followed the editor of a medium town newspaper. He used the pseudonym of Mr. Gates, and he noticed Mr. Gates every week received thousands of news, but he killed 90% of them, only published 10%. So the gatekeeping is this process why out of 100 news, only 10 comes to be published. Next one. And of course we come to some theoretical references offered for this session. Pamela Shoemaker, Karin Barzilai-Nahon, they have published books on gatekeeping and modern media, particularly internet media, but the general model remains very much the same. Next one. Now, in totalitarian regime, gatekeeping is institutional. In Soviet Russia or Nazi Germany, they were censorship offices, and they didn't use the word gatekeeping, but that's what they did. The censorship offices are there to make sure that only some news actually reach the population. Next one. Now, another concept is fake news. Next one. Of course, this concept becomes popular because of President Trump using daily the expression fake news, and even there is virtually no academic study about fake news before 2016, i.e. before Trump started using fake news. Next one. Definition of fake news largely come from a professor of philosophy, such as Neil Levy or Regina Rimi, and they try to distinguish fake news from false news. Not all false news are fake news. Axel Gelfert, also a professor of philosophy, came out with a more simple definition. Fake news is the deliberate presentation of typically false or misleading claims as news, where the claims are misleading by design. So nobody makes a mistake. They want to create fake news. It's systematical, and it's in a way believable. I see we have Italian colleagues today. This morning, Corriere della Sera reported of an academic study that more than 70% of Italians believe in the fake news. They are unable to, even the most blatant satirical fake, they believe they are real news. Next one. And Gelfert in his article also says why people believe in fake news, because we have cognitive biases like confirmation bias. Fake news confirm what we already believe. Repetition effect. If it's said 10, 20, 100 times, it should be true. Priming. Some words like cult in our field trigger an emotional reaction. And affective arousal. There are some items, children, they beat children or they kill children, and that immediately generates huge reaction. Next one. Cults. Next one. Fake news is a recent label, but there are studies of how what we will today call fake news is very old. David Bryan Davis wrote a landmark article on anti-Catholicism and anti-Mormonism, anti-Masonism in the 19th century America. In Canada, you had Shinniki, was very famous as inventing anti-Catholic fake news. And so news labeling as cults or bad groups, some religious groups, are a very old story. Next one. And of course, in the cult wars, Jim Richardson wrote a number of articles on cult phobia, fake news about cults being all evil and bad and using brainwashing were very common. Next one. Now, next one. How gatekeeping works, particularly in our field, the new religious movements labeled as cults. Until a few years ago, most of the negative information about so-called cults was spread by private moral entrepreneurs, the anti-cult movements, or other religions saying my religion is good, your religion is bad. But recently we see the massive intervention of public powers. For instance, Russia is a big purveyor of fake news about Jehovah's Witnesses and Scientology because they have an international problem. They are censored by the OSCE, the UN, and the European Union, the European Court, for their liquidation of Jehovah's Witnesses and now also for their measures against Scientology. So they have to justify this, and we see massive fake news. My favorite one is Eisenhower invented the Cold War because he was a Jehovah's Witness. Now, the kernel of truth is the mother of Eisenhower was a Jehovah's Witness, but of course Jehovah's Witnesses don't serve in the army and don't run for public office. But you see in articles spread by Sputnik, that's the Russian propaganda arm, about the Jehovah's Witnesses inventing the Cold War through Eisenhower. Next one. Now China has a similar problem because China created the category of Seijiao. Actually, it exists since the Ming period. It's often translated as evil cults, but our Chinese-speaking colleague keep telling us it's the wrong translation. It means heterodox teachings. And if you are in the list of Seijiao and you are active in these groups, you go to jail. So they have to justify this, accusing the Seijiao of a number of wrongdoings. So my case study is about a horrific crime which was committed in a McDonald's in 2014 in the Chinese town of Zhaozhuan. Next one. But since it was falsely, as we will see, attributed to a new religious movements called the Church of Almighty God. What's the Church of Almighty God? Next one. Church of Almighty God may be today, after Falun Gong has been almost eradicated, the largest Chinese new religious movement. Governmental published sources says it has 4 million members. The number may be inflated, but nobody really knows. And the main teaching of this church is Jesus came back in the shape of Almighty God. Most of her teachings are in this book, The Word Appeared in the Flesh. Next one. The Church of Almighty God was established in 91 and was immediately perceived as a threat by the communist regime. Number one, because it grew very rapidly. They don't like this in China. It doesn't advocate any revolution. It says for both theological and political reasons the dragon will fall by itself. Next one. In 95, Church of Almighty God went on the list of Seijiao. Church claims more than 300,000 members have been arrested. We don't know about the numbers, but we know Chinese media continuously report successful operations against this church. In these very days, there is something going on called Operation Thunder, and every day there are hundreds of members of this church arrested. Some years ago, the Church of Almighty God sent to a number of scholars, including me, a secret document about how to organize the propaganda against the Church of Almighty God. We don't know whether it's true, but it's more or less believable. Next one. So what's the McDonald's murder? Next one. Unfortunately, the McDonald's murder really happened. It's not fake news. It's a real crime. In 2014, this lady you see was killed in a McDonald's in Zhaojuan. 6 missionaries entered the McDonald's and they started asking the cell phone numbers of the customers for future contacts. And this lady said, I will not give my phone number to you, so she was pronounced an evil spirit and killed on the spot. Next one. Now, I was among the scholars who were invited twice to China. Second time, Eileen Barker, who is here, was in the group, but the McDonald's we discussed mostly the first time in Henan, and the local media said we went there with an open spirit, which is certainly true, and we are very grateful for the invitation and for having received so many interesting documents. Next one. But upon examination of the documents, though, it emerged very clearly that the McDonald's murder was not perpetrated by members of the Church of Almighty God, but by members of a different group. They call themselves the True Almighty God, but believes that Almighty God was one soul in 2 bodies, the bodies of its 2 leaders, Zhang Fan and Lu Yinchun. So it's different Almighty God. Next one. If you read the transcripts of the trial, not any interpretation, you see that Lu Yinchun was one of the part of the dual deity. She was asked, what about the Church of Almighty God, whose administrative leader, is a man called Zhao Weishan in New York. And she answered, that's a false Almighty God. We are the true Almighty God. And it's in a way paradoxical because we say they are Seijiao, they are bad people, and we are good people. We had to kill an evil spirit, but we are good people. And they are bad people, and if you persecute them, we applaud you. But we are a different group. Now, there is an Australian scholar, Emily Dunn, which shares the opinion, which is not an opinion, it's a fact, that it was not the Church of Almighty God, but say perhaps they were former members. But she, I believe, overlooked an interview granted in jail by the other part of the Almighty God, some fan who was executed in 2015. And of course, these interviews in jail were given to governmental media with governmental permission. And she was asked the question, were you in contact with the Church of Almighty God? And she said, I would have liked to. It's an interesting group, but I never met them. They were not in my area, and they are very secretive, so I didn't manage to have any contact with them. Next one. Now, so it's very clear that it's a different group, but immediately the Chinese governmental media started attributing the crime to Church of Almighty God, and particularly two British media, BBC and the Telegraph, through their Beijing offices, were crucial in spreading the news that the homicide has been perpetrated by Church of Almighty God. And it was so successful that in December 2017 I counted 20,000 media attributing the homicide to the Church of Almighty God. Next one. So the gatekeeping worked very well, because out of a thick folder of what the police determined through its investigation really happened in the McDonald's in South Juan, almost nothing of the real facts passed the gate. What passed the gate was the cult narrative and the false reference to the Church of Almighty God. Next one. This, I believe, is very interesting for us because it shows the effects of gatekeeping, because the gatekeeping in this case left out the essential. And the essential was very interesting. I sent material to David Bromley, who studied violence in religious movements, and we wrote an article together. This group, the Real Almighty God, which is not the Church of Almighty God, is a very interesting group which needs to be studied. It's a small group, but is nonetheless interesting. Next one. So the story shows that violence erupts more often in comparatively small group. Church of Almighty God has 1 million members. This group never had more than 30 members. And in these small groups, actually extreme radicalization is more common. And also radicalization is gradual. Next one. So since we are in Canada, we can compare with the Solar Temple. And the Solar Temple also was a comparatively small group which gradually started believing they were engaged in a cosmic battle against evil, which can only end in homicide and suicide. Next one. They say the Real Almighty God, the Lujin Chun Zamfan group, was a small group, and also it went to homicide gradually. These people were on trial for their life. 2 were executed, and at trial they spent a lot of time discussing a dog. How they identified the dog as an evil spirit and killed the dog. And killing the dog was actually very important, because by killing the dog, they started practicing the idea that evil spirits should be killed. And so next was to kill the poor woman in the McDonald's. Next one. In conclusion, seriously studying the McDonald's homicide, And the career of the group which committed it, I believe, circulated, thanks to Adam, an article I wrote about it, is very useful for the study of violence in new religious movements. We can compare it to the Solar Temple and to other similar groups. But for the first years, this study did not happen, because the gatekeeping created by the Chinese authorities, it was not spontaneous, only filtered the news, actually fake news, connecting the homicide to the Church of Almighty God. And the real story of the group, it would have been extremely interesting, didn't go through. So gatekeeping not only damages those stereotyped as cults, but sometimes can also mislead us, sometimes even misleading scholars, not to study what is really interesting. Because if what is really interesting doesn't suit the gatekeeper's agenda, it's edited out. And to find this news, perhaps you need to go to China and interact with the authorities, and you need a lot of homework. Thank you.
Thank you very much.